Y'all already know. But I did want to go over this article from the Huffington Post from a couple days ago. It was written by Michael Hobbs, and it's kind of a long read, so I might do a little bit of skipping, but I thought that overall, this was some pretty responsible reporting. um, on the topic of child sex trafficking, and so I really wanted to talk about it just as a sort of, I don't know, informative type of thing. Is informative the word I'm looking for? Yeah. So, let's see. So the title of the article is the futile quest for hard numbers on sex trafficking. And Michael Hobbs says social media posts describe sex trafficking as a huge and growing problem, but credible estimates indicate smaller numbers. And of course, the author, I can't check me out with my words. Whew. The author starts off by saying, as if we needed any more problems in 2020, the last few months have made it increasingly difficult to separate fact from fiction when it comes to child sex trafficking. It was, or at least should have been obvious that the online furniture retailer Wayfair was not selling children overpriced cabinets. But what about those Save the Children rallies a few weeks later? Or all those social media posts bouncing around claiming that children were disappearing by the thousands. And I don't know if y'all saw that, but someone claimed they found 37 children living in a trailer in Alabama or something, and they were all kidnapped and sex trafficked. That did not happen.
How did it get confirmed to not have happened?
Oh, because they were all various missing persons cases throughout the entire state. It was not all of those children congregated in one trailer home being sex trafficked, as was claimed.
Oh, so that was just a lie.
Yeah, that didn't happen. They were actually missing kids, and not all of them were kidnapped. I would have to go back and double check. I don't even think all of them were kidnapped. Some of them were more like custody disputes, where a parent was late returning the child and someone called the police and reported them as missing or being kidnapped, and it was I mean that's still a serious issue and is a domestic dispute, but it's not the parent was taking them across state lines so that they would never see their mom again or something like that. So that's a little bit different than kidnapping someone to sex traffic them. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So so that didn't happen. I can go back and find that story too if y'all want. So the author continues, child sex trafficking is a fraught, troubling topic that's hard to talk about in any medium. But for a year, I've been talking to anti-trafficking charities, academic experts, and sex workers about the real threats to children and how they differ from the sensationalized screenshots taking over the internet. The biggest problem I've found is the definition of child sex trafficking itself. Under the law, anyone under 18 who trades sex for money, drugs, or a place to stay, or anything else of value is a victim of trafficking. They don't have to be recruited by a pimp, moved across state lines, or forced into prostitution. A homeless runaway having sex with a sleazeball in exchange for a warm bed is a tragedy, but is far less salacious than the taken myths that trafficking memes circulating on social media imply. And it's also far more common. I talked about that a lot. It is not like that Taken movie. Sketchy statistics also make it nearly impossible to know what to think about child sex trafficking. The internet is awash in exaggerated, misleading, and downright fabricated numbers about how many children are forced into the sex trade every year. This is my attempt to debunk all the false trafficking numbers and walk you through the reliable ones. But because sex trafficking is indeed something that deserves your moral attention, but it does look nothing like the memes you see on social media. So, question, is there any truth to the stories about hundreds of thousands of children being trafficked? In a word, no. No. Despite what your anti-vax aunt has been sharing on Facebook, there is no evidence that children are being RFID chipped so traffickers can keep track of them. Spammy text messages are not notifying trackers of your location. And in general, any theory that depends on insidious criminal networks communicating through back window graffiti in a Kroger parking lot is not going to check out. He mentioned these three things specifically because those all happened. Those things happen. These people are actually claiming that human traffickers are putting microchips in children so they can track them and transport them. People are complaining or saying that these random text messages that you get, are people sex traffickers are doing it to find your GPS location on your phone. Also with the back window graffiti, there was one where someone was saying that sex traffickers were in parking lots tying ribbons around car windows, the rear side passenger mirrors, and that was like sex trafficking. Anyone who's driving a white van is a sex trafficker. I mean, like there's so many of these myths, and they're just ridiculous. Now, where it gets a little harder to separate fact from fiction is in the numerical claims. One of the most circulated social media statistics is the claim that 800,000 children go missing each year. You've seen this figure, or possibly one of its offshoots, the claim that 22,000 kids go missing per day, or that the annual victims of trafficking could fill a stadium a few times over. None of those things are true. The figure is false, both specifically and generally. Specifically, 800,000 children do not go missing every year. That figure is from a 2002 survey that asked parents if they had reported their children as runaways in the previous year. The figure was 700,000. A more recent incredible figure is 424,000, and that's from 2018. That's still a lot of missing kids, but what's important to know about that number, or every other large estimate of missing children circulating online, is that it refers to reports of missing children, not the actual number of children who disappear each year. There is a crucial difference. The vast majority of children who are reported missing, most reports put it at over 90%, eventually return home, usually within hours or days. Nor do these, so we're at, this damn phone will not stop going off. All right. So we're at 700,000 children. 90% of them were returned home in a few days. So yeah, that number is nowhere near accurate. Nor do these reports represent children who are kidnapped by strangers. Roughly half of missing children reports, missing child reports relate to custody disputes. A father takes the kids for the weekend, for example, but doesn't come back on Sunday night, and the mother calls the cops. These situations can be tragedies in their own right, but they have nothing to do with sex trafficking. The rest of the missing children reports, so I'm glad somebody else is paying attention to that. I feel slightly vindicated now. The rest of the missing children reports mostly relate to runaways. Children in abusive homes, especially those in foster care, often run away and sleep at a friend's house or on the street for a few days. This includes queer and trans minors who run away from parents who have rejected them. Every time a guardian asks the police to help with a search, they end up in the statistics. Many of these children end up running away multiple times each year, so the FBI figures likely to include a significant number of duplicate reports.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Right. Yeah. That's something people don't think about. I fully understand why these kids are running away, and that's absolutely awful that they're in an abusive home. But, a child in a bad home situation who runs away 10 times is listed as, 10 cases of a missing child, even though it's the same child and they keep being found, which is, definitely something that we should be focused on and work on. But that's very different than 10 kids got kidnapped by a pimp. These are very different stories, So, these are tragedies, but overwhelmingly not trafficking. These aren't the only false statistics that have gone viral this summer. A widely shared graphic shows a spike in human trafficking arrests after Donald Trump took office. I'm sure that's thanks to fucking those QAnon people. And that was found to be using fabricated figures. I wasn't able to find the origin of the oddly resilient claim that children are 66,000 times more likely to be sold to human traffickers than die of COVID. That doesn't even seem like good math, honestly. I'll just say literally anything. But that would also mean that 7% of all children in the United States were trafficked annually. I'm going to need to see a citation before I smash that share button. What is clear is that years of data indicate a small number of children are kidnapped by strangers every year. The generally accepted figure is about 115 stereotypical kidnappings per year, according to the Crimes Against Children Research Center. If that's not enough to convince you, then consider this. The Amber Alert system, which was specifically set up to address stranger kidnappings, only received 161 alerts throughout the entire United States in 2018. Of those 161, 12 were based on misunderstandings and 11 turned out to be hoaxes. Right. Yeah. It gets a little bit different when you actually really look at the numbers and the data. Okay, so the numbers in Facebook memes are bonkers. What about the numbers from legitimate anti-trafficking organizations? So the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is one of America's most prominent anti-trafficking organizations. Of the more than 23,500 endangered runaways reported in 2019, 1 in 6 were likely to be victims of child sex trafficking. This is one of the most repeated statistics about child sex trafficking. However, it comes with major caveats. First, it does not refer to all missing children. Stasia Shahan, the NCMEC's Vice President of Analytical Services, said the figure applies only to missing cases that were reported specifically to the NCMEC. Now take a look at the organization's name again, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Given the organization's mission, the reports it receives will be heavily skewed towards cases in which caregivers suspect exploitation. The 23,000 reports to the NCMEC in 2019 are a small infraction of the roughly alleged 420,000 total reports of missing children each year. But that's not even the most misleading thing about how the statistic gets used. The statistic is carefully worded. 1 in 6 children is likely to be a victim of sex trafficking. As Shahan told me, the organization considers a child as a likely trafficking victim if the person filing the report suspects that the child was trafficked. NCMEC doesn't confirm whether these suspicions are later determined to be true. Given the increasing prominence of child sex trafficking in media reports, many of these reports will turn out to be false. The same slippery definitions and careful wording show up in other sex trafficking statistics, like the frequently reported statement that 300,000 children are at risk of being trafficked into commercial sex. Everyone from the Department of Justice to prominent anti-trafficking organizations to Ashton Kutcher has repeated this number. Not only is it meaningless, what exactly does at-risk mean? We don't know. It also has no credibility among actual experts in child sexual exploitation. The estimate comes from a 2001 paper, which states that 300,000 minors, and according to the paper, it was actually 325,000 minors, were subject to risk factors that make them vulnerable to trafficking, such as growing up in public housing, experiencing homelessness, or being in a gang. For each category, researchers estimated the number of potential victims. So for homeless youth, they calculated 523,000 runaways, 35% of whom were gone for more than a week. That gave them 183,000 kids. From there, they simply multiplied by risk of trafficking. In homeless shelters, the chances were 30%, on the streets 70. They ran the numbers and suddenly 121,000 children were at risk of trafficking. They repeated the same calculation for 16 other categories to reach total figures. If you don't have a background in statistics, it might not be clear how garbage this analysis is, but at its most basic level, the researchers' categories aren't meaningfully distinct from each other. Lots of kids who grow up in public housing also end up homeless, which means that the authors could count the same kids 2, 3, or 4 times. Not only that, but almost all the numbers are inflated. Not even close to 35% of runaway kids are gone for more than a week. Nowhere near 70% of street youth end up being trafficked. The number is based on bad assumptions, bad methods, and bad data. Don't trust me, trust experts. In 2008, according to the Crimes Against Children Research Center, they published a report behind the 300,000 figure and called it crude and concluded in bold and capital letters, please do not cite these numbers. When a Washington Post fact checker contacted the author of the report, he admitted that he would not use the same method again if he were to redo the paper. Good to know. Okay, I'm going to scroll down a little bit because this is a super long article and I kind of want to keep it somewhat short. The lack of credible statistics on child sex trafficking is noteworthy. Other threats to children, from gun violence, roughly 3,000 deaths per year, car crashes, roughly 4,000 deaths per year, to sexual abuse, 1 in 9 for girls, 1 in 53 for boys, are backed up by firm, consistent statistics about their prevalence. Most estimates of child sex trafficking, by contrast, use figures from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, a database that collates anonymous reports from phone calls, texts, and internet forums. The organization doesn't make any effort to confirm those reports. As Carolyn Demar, the hotline's director, told me in February, rising or falling call volumes may simply indicate growing public awareness of trafficking as a social issue, not necessarily a change in the prevalence of trafficking itself. That's why over time, sex trafficking organizations have drifted into one of 2 categories. Some provide no statistics on the prevalence of sex trafficking at all, and others use old, debunked, or irrelevant statistics to declare the problem is large and growing. To put it lightly, This is odd. Child sex trafficking is not a new problem. Advocacy organizations have been pushing for increased awareness since the 90s. Congress passed the first major legislation on the issue in 2000, and yet even as anti-trafficking groups have collected hundreds of millions of dollars in donations and carried out near constant awareness campaigns, they still have not produced any credible research on the scale or nature of the problem that they're focused on addressing. Again, with the, they're not in business to put themselves out of business, and they should be, We don't have perfect information, but what we do know is that child sex trafficking is less widespread than the viral social media posts make it seem. The Human Trafficking Institute reported that federal authorities initiated 145 human trafficking cases in 2019. Of those, 88 involved children. Other sources indicate a similar scale. According to a Texas Christian University database of every trafficking case in the country, federal prosecutors took on a total of 642 cases involving sex trafficking of minors from 2000 to 2015, roughly 43 a year. Which I think is really important to point out because, I would assume law enforcement isn't catching everybody who's been trafficked. But if it's literally hundreds of thousands of children a year who are being trafficked, they can't be so inept that they're only finding 43 a year. Like, you can't have 300,000 kids being trafficked and only finding 43. Like, that, come on.
And these folks, they have some pretty decent funding behind them.
Oh, hundreds of millions of dollars.
Hundreds of millions of dollars.
It's an industry at this point.
It's an industry. There are 52 weeks in a year.
Yeah.
So they're getting less than one a week.
Yes.
With all this funding.
Yes. And, that's something that I've mentioned, on the regular podcast and Swapcast as well, is you have to really be careful about the wording in the media. Like, for example, it wasn't about minors, but it was sex trafficking, the Robert Kraft case, right? With the massage parlor with the Asian workers. Every one who reported on it as a human trafficking case, like local outlets, major outlets. It was a human trafficking case. They were rescuing these women from being sex slaves. That was like how it was being framed. It was like Asian sex slaves. But now that the case is wrapping up, absolutely nobody was charged with human trafficking because nobody was being trafficked. There was definitely illegal sex work happening there, which shouldn't be illegal, but whatever, not the point. But the point is that, it was framed as trafficking, and now you're like, well, who got trafficked? Nobody. And that's a constant thing every time they have these human trafficking stings, and it'll be like local law enforcement working with county sheriffs, working with state police, working with the FBI or other federal agencies. They always frame these things as being, for trafficking. But if you look at the actual arrests and who's getting charged, just sex workers being charged with prostitution charges and a couple clients.
And the Robert Kraft one was the one where there was a football coach involved.
Robert Kraft owns a football team.
Okay. And and is that the same one where the police had hidden cameras in there for days, weeks?
Yeah, that's the one where police made a fake bomb and put it in the plaza where the spa was to evacuate it and said, oh, there's a bomb threat. Everybody needs to get out. And then while everybody evacuated the spa, they installed cameras and then watched these sex workers performing sex acts with their clients repeatedly before coming in because they needed the evidence.
See, that's the creepy shit. That makes you just never want to click any pornography again because you're like, is this something some amateurs really made, or is this something?
You follow sex workers and buy their content.
There you go.
Yes. But yeah, no, I get what you mean because police actually do that a lot. And, police are still arguing that if they can't have sex with sex workers, that they won't be able to collect sufficient evidence. Like, that's still an argument that's ongoing. So
collect sufficient evidence.
Yes.
Like, are you actually taking vaginal mucus and then taking it back to the lab and testing it to see if this was used to make a financial transaction?
They just, they like to be disgusting.
Yeah, they're basically just good Christians.
Ugh.
If you're a wine cellar audience member, you get it. You get what I'm saying.
Yes.
They're good Christians.
Mm-hmm. And of course, this average of 43 a year, these figures only represent federal prosecutions. According to a 2019 study, 190 suspects were charged under state laws for human trafficking in 2012, the most recent year the data was available. So we're still at 43 plus 109. So we're still like under 300. Yeah.
Under 3. So they almost have a Spartan movie.
Almost have a Spartan movie, or almost one every day for a year. While we're at it, there's no evidence for the theory that human trafficking rings are tied to shadowy international criminals. A survey of every human trafficking case prosecuted from 2000 to 2015 found that none of the cases were linked to international cartels or organized crime. Prosecutions, of course, don't tell the whole story, but other data sources indicate child sex trafficking at a similar scale. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, child protection authorities in 27 states identified 741 victims of sex trafficking in 2018. But surely this undercounts the problem. Commercial sex with children is an underground market that, by definition, isn't perfectly captured by reports. But also keep in mind what the author said earlier, that sex trafficking is anybody under 18 exchanging, trading sex for some sort of payment. So out of these 741, to say that they found 741 victims of sex trafficking doesn't necessarily mean somebody who was groomed and then, was sexually abused, by a pimp or was kidnapped by a sex trafficker. It could also be a 16-year-old runaway who's trading sex for, some creep to pay for their motel room, which is slightly different than being coerced by a third party, as we think of like pimping, as it were. So very different situations. So keep that in mind too. Let's see. While it's undoubtedly true, a significant percentage of trafficking victims are reluctant to come forward, underreporting simply cannot explain the scale of mismatch. Take, for example, a 2016 estimate that claims 79,000 people 79,000 people under the age of 18 were victims of sex trafficking in Texas alone. But the same report noted that law enforcement authorities identified a total of 320 minors who were victims of sex trafficking from 2007 to 2014. If both of those figures are correct, then just 0.41% of child sex trafficking victims, or 1 in 244, are found by police. 1 out of 244. Those are some abysmal fucking odds.
1 out of...
if that's true. Really think about these numbers and break them down. If 79,000 children in Texas are victims of sex trafficking, but police only have 320 cases, 1 in 244 are the only ones police are finding. So really think about these numbers, how they apply, because people see it and it just seems so overwhelming, 80,000 kids trafficked. But think about it, logically, how does that work?
If that was actually happening, nigga, you think Antifa is wild in the streets? Parents would be wild in the streets if that was really going down. And then you got to think, not just parents, those kids have other family members, friends, sympathetic people, and I'm pretty sure Antifa would show up for that one too.
Antifa would show up for that one, yeah. Because nobody, other than pedophiles, nobody likes the idea of child sex trafficking.
Rape trafficking?
No, we're not doing that. So, I really wanted to think about that. And this article closes out saying, what's a better way to think about the issue? None of this means that child sex trafficking victims don't matter or we shouldn't care. They do and we should. But Americans have spent the last 2 decades, especially the last 3 months, hearing nonstop warning about pedophiles coming for our kids and that traffickers are everywhere and we should maintain constant vigilance against outside threats. It's more reasonable and responsible to ask whether the wide array of things to panic about if child sex trafficking is one of them. All available evidence indicates child sex trafficking is one of the huge number of American tragedies concentrated against the most vulnerable children in society. Most minors who engage in commercial sex do so out of desperation because they are homeless or pushed out of families for being queer or trans. Though some children are indeed recruited into commercial sex by family members or domestic partners, these arrangements are almost always the result of lifelong trauma and vulnerability, the kind of problems that societies solve by bolstering safety nets and expanding social services. This might be the boring conclusion, but it's a necessary one. Caring about children does not mean sharing lurid memes about the monster lurking around the corner. It means being honest about what truly puts children at risk, even if the solution requires something we should have done years ago. And so I just found this article to be really responsible and useful when it comes to actually looking at the numbers and breaking down the stats. And, this is something that sex worker orgs have been saying forever is police are saying all these hundreds of thousands of people are trafficked. And it's well, where the fuck are they? Come on. And honestly, it's also a conversation around this whole Blue Lives Matter and we trust police. And it's if police can only find 1 out of every 250 child sex trafficking victims, maybe your faith in police is misplaced. I'm just going to throw that out there because those are not great odds.
They can still trust the police to handle Neggers, uppity women, white kids with green hair, and anyone else that the white man in overalls and a John Deere tractor don't like. We can trust the police to handle that.
But yeah, so I really do think it's important to look at articles like this and like really break down the numbers. Like, it's just not like, do you honestly think that there's 244 kids who are just every day just being trafficked and nobody knows where they are? Like, come on, just really think about it, So I just wanted to bring that up, go through that. I will add a link to this article from the Huffington Post, and I think that's all I have. So
that's all we have time. It's 2:04 p.m.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're out of here.
Yeah, I don't even have time. Like, I have to mix this down late
Later.
tonight when I get off work or tomorrow. But I'm working on going to bed shortly after getting off work, so that I can kind of get up at like 3 p.m. and sort of have the rest of my sort of like introvert nighttime by myself.
Yeah.
Right. Like, yeah, like I was actually like waking up as soon as you were going to bed.
Yeah.
And it was like, yeah, I'm going to start and put some shit in the laundry, have a doobie, look at a show, read an article, look up Tamala Horsford again. All right. WineCellarMedia.com. But this is Swapcast. That's
Bye, y'all.
for SwapUSA.org. Indeedly do, neighbor. And forgot to play the closing music. All right. Get the heck out of here.